Hi everyone, my name's Leanne and today I'm going to be telling you about my favourite books of the year so far. So in a few days, you will see my mid-year freakout tag where I will be going into more details around kind of themes and some of the points of note from my reading year so far. And then I will also have a reading stats video, so keep your eyes peeled for both of those. And if you're not already subscribed to the channel, please do, so you can see those when they get uploaded. But I suppose a bit of a top line overview of how my reading is going so far this year. I have read 70 books already this year, and that makes me so happy. I am reading way more books than I have in the past few years. There were definitely years where I very easily read kind of 120, 130, 140, 150 books in a year, but it has been a little while since I felt like reaching those numbers was really quite comfortable. Obviously, it's not just about the quantity of books that you read, but as someone that does have a pretty substantial number of unread books on my shelves, it's really good to be kind of making sure that I'm chipping away at those books and having a really good time while doing so. And I definitely feel like in terms of enjoyment, I'm feeling like I'm having a really great reading year. There have definitely been some duds, some disappointments. I will talk about that more in the mid-year freakout tag. And I will say not all of the books that I'm going to talk about today in this top 10 were 5-star books. I feel like my reading in the first half of the year has set me up really nicely for the second half of the year, where there are so many books that I'm really excited to read that I do feel like are going to be really strong 5 stars. Okay, we are just about to get into the books, but I do want to say I don't include any books that are related to my job in this list. But to be honest, there have actually been a few 5-star reads from books that I've read for work, but I just like to keep the lists slightly separate. Anyway, I'm going to start with the 2 young adult books that were new favorites for this year. Firstly, Gwen Art Are Not in Love by Lex Croucher. So this was a book that really took me by surprise. I went into it with very few expectations. I read some of Lex's books before and I always really enjoyed their writing, but none of their books were new 5-star favorites for me until I read Gwen Art Are Not in Love. One of my favorite romance tropes is fake dating, and I loved this book's way more literal presentation of that trope. So we have Gwen and Art, who are meant to be getting married, which doesn't really work for either of them because they're both actually queer, so don't want to be in this male-female heterosexual relationship. So they literally are fake dating, and I suppose kind of covering for each other. I found that setup really fun, but there was also just so much silliness and joy in this book, and seeing all of the kind of jousting and feasts in this book, it was really kind of immersive in this setting. It was really funny. I loved the romantic relationships, which in this book are kind of the side relationships, and we're following this really fantastic friendship blossom between our 2 lead characters. And I did really enjoy seeing the chemistry of the romantic relationships, but also the chemistry of the friendship. I loved how the kind of contemporary queer tone of this book was combined with that more kind of medieval seeming setting. And I think there's a lot to be said for books that become favorites because they were simply so much fun. And that's the case for this one. So quite different in tone, but staying with queer YA. The next book I want to talk about is The Boy I Love by William Hussey. So this is a proof copy. The final cover looks slightly different to this. This is a love story that is set against the horrors of the First World War. We are following 19-year-old Stephen as he returns to the war, and he is dealing with these incredibly heartbreaking feelings of grief following the death of his first love, who was another boy. When he returns to the war, he develops a relationship with a new recruit called Danny, and the intimacy of their friendship grows into something more romantic. And I just thought this was such an incredibly powerful novel that shone a light on a period of history that I didn't know tons about, and had a really kind of personal story at the center of this huge historical moment. And I thought how the author explored how queer men were treated in society more broadly, but also specifically within the army, was so sensitively and heartbreakingly told. We follow these young men who are supposedly fighting for freedom, but it's not a freedom that is afforded to them as queer men. These men, lay their lives on the line to protect their country, but their country doesn't want to protect them or keep them safe. And yeah, this book was really sort of heartbreaking, but I think so poignant and so important. I must get a finished copy to replace this proof. Okay, now on to fiction for grown-ups. I will say, like, none of these books are in any particular order, but I would say, like, my top 3 probably are a top 3. Another book that I need to get a copy to replace the proof that I read is Nesting by Roisin O'Donnell. Some books have their positions on this favourites list because they were fun. That is not the case with Nesting. Nesting is on here because it was so accomplished. So in Nesting, we are following a woman fleeing from an abusive marriage with her 2 kids and a 3rd child on the way. Not only do we see the personal difficulties that she faces in leaving this relationship, you know, convincing herself that it wasn't as bad as she first thought, convincing herself that because it was not physically violent, it doesn't count as abuse, convincing herself that she won't be able to survive without her husband, convincing herself that she can't mother her children alone and that she is like depriving them of kind of the safety and comfort of their family home by taking them away from that. There are all those kinds of personal struggles that she is dealing with throughout the book, but we're also looking at the societal and systemic restrictions that prevent her from escaping, specifically within Ireland. We see the difficulties that she faces being unable to get adequate housing, unable to find employment and childcare, the huge amounts of kind of like red tape and like documentation, the hoops that she needs to jump through in order to be able to gain some sort of independence and stability away from her husband. And I think a book is always incredibly accomplished when it elicits quite a physical reaction from you, and that's how I felt when I was reading this book. Not only did I find myself angry on our protagonist's behalf because of the brick walls that she continuously comes up against in trying to get herself and her kids to safety and stability, but I also found myself incredibly frustrated with her as an individual. You know, you feel the need to like shake her when she does end up making decisions or following like thought processes that aren't going to help her. And I think if you yourself or you have seen people trying to get out of difficult and abusive relationships like that, you will recognize that pattern of behavior. The other thing that I was really impressed with this book for was how the children were written. I think it's really, really challenging to write children well in an adult novel, and I think the author really nailed it. I was really impressed by this book, so I do need to grab myself a finished copy to add to my shelves. In the first half of the year, I really enjoyed This Love by Lottie Jeffs. So this is about a very kind of intense and intimate friendship between 2 characters called May and Ari, who met when they were at Leeds University. And we follow their friendship from that initial meeting through their university years and into their adult lives over the course of a number of years. And we see how they move in and out of each other's lives, their life circumstances change, whether that is, you know, where they are in their careers or in their romantic relationships. We follow the turbulence of their lives and the secrets that they end up keeping from one another. And I loved how this book explored their different experiences of queerness. So May is a lesbian, and she assumes that Ari is gay, but Ari is actually bisexual. He's interested in dating men and women. And one of the things I really loved about his character was how he really embraced his femininity and seeing his struggles with being constantly assumed to be a gay man and having, you know, his bisexual identity erased. I really appreciated seeing that perspective. I love books that really explore quite intense friendships. I love books that have really kind of nuanced and flawed characters as well. Both May and Ari and their surrounding cast of characters, none of them are perfect. They all make mistakes. They all make poor decisions and they all upset one another. And that's just kind of true to life. Another thing that I really loved about this book was how it highlighted how queer families can look different, that they can take different shapes and sizes, and how the role of the family doesn't need to be this kind of nuclear heterosexual setup. And I think it's really important to discuss how for queer people, building a family isn't always that straightforward. Unsurprisingly, there are quite a few queer books on this list, and the next one I want to talk about is Double Booked. this really took me by surprise. I went into it with quite muted expectations and I was really pleasantly surprised by it. So this is about Georgina, who has quite a kind of regimented, scheduled life. And she thinks she's quite content with that until one day she has what can only be described as a queer awakening, but also a creative awakening. One night she ends up auditioning for this lesbian pop group, and this not only awakens her to her repressed sexuality, she has been in a long-term relationship with a man and has repressed lots of her feelings for women. We see her gradually embrace her interest in women and her attraction to women, but also we see her embrace her kind of repressed creativity. So she, for her day job, teaches kids how to play piano, and being part of this group of musicians opens her eyes to what she really wants to do creatively. I really appreciated seeing a book about someone that came to understand their sexuality when they were slightly older. I think we hear a lot about kind of teenagers learning about their sexuality, but it can be something that happens, in people's 20s, 30s and beyond, so that they come to these realizations. There was a lot in this book that I just really kind of connected to, and I think if you are a bisexual woman, there's lots of stuff that you will connect with in this book. Staying with the bisexuals, Big Date Energy by Bethany Rutter. This is one of those ones that makes it onto the favorites list, largely because of how much fun it was, how much I just purely enjoyed the reading experience of this one. So this is about Fran, who has been quite a serial monogamist. She has gone from long-term relationship to long-term relationship, and she has now decided that she wants to fully enjoy and embrace her singledom. So she is going on lots of different dates with men, with women. And I loved how this book reclaimed the idea of the greedy bisexual. That was one of my favorite things about this book. I think because there's this stereotype around bisexuals just wanting to shag everyone, it's something that can often be pushed against because it can be quite a damaging stereotype. But what I loved about this book was how it embraced the fact that Fran was in a stage or a phase in her life where that's what she wanted to do. But I did also really appreciate the tipping point that she comes to realize, where she begins to question whether she's having fun with that kind of lifestyle anymore. One of the other driving forces of this plot is Fran being entered into this dating show by her mother, and the person she ends up being paired with to have dinner with on this dating show, which the closest thing I can compare the show to is First Dates. The person she ends up being matched with is actually her first love, and reconnecting with this woman really leads Fran to confront a lot of stuff around her past and her dating history. As I said, this one was so much fun, and I think it really perfectly captured the fun and the chaos and the turbulence of having a very single part of your life. So the first book I read this year was Honey and Spice by Bolu Babalola, and it's just really stayed with me since. It's another one where I just thought it was so much fun. So this is set at a university, and I always really love books that have university or college settings, and we are following the romance between Kiki and Malachi. So Kiki runs this student radio show, and that was something that I really enjoyed reading about as well, as someone that did do student radio when I was at uni. But she has this radio show where her intention is to kind of be somewhat of an agony aunt, give advice and kind of protect her listeners from heartbreak. Through one of her lecturers, she ends up connecting with this guy called Malachi, who has quite a reputation for being a player on campus. And because it will be mutually beneficial for them, it will give Kiki this kind of hook for her new radio show, they decide to start fake dating. And of course, that close proximity leads to some blurred lines in their friendship. And it's a friendship that has a lot of chemistry to it, a lot of tension to it. And unsurprisingly, it blossoms into an actual romance. But I felt this book had far more substance than a lot of the romance books that I have read in the past. Some romance books, you want it to be a quick and fun read, and that is so fantastic. But I definitely felt this one had a way more kind of substance to it and a bit more grit to it. And the way the author wrote that romantic and sexual tension was fantastic. I'm really glad this was the first book that I read in the year. It got me off to a really good start. Okay, we're in the top 3 now, and I would say the books I've spoken to up until this point, no particular order, but these ones I'd say they're like the top three. She's Always Hungry by Eliza Clark. Now, this is such a surprising book for me to have on this list for multiple reasons. Firstly, it's a short story collection. Typically, short story collections don't make it onto these lists. You know, if it's an anthology, I feel like you just don't get on with like all of the different writing styles. If it's a collection from all of the same like author, some stories are better than others. I just feel like it's really difficult for a short story collection to make its way onto like a favorites list for me. But the other reason why this is such a surprise is because like thematically and genre wise, this isn't the type of thing that I am typically drawn to. A lot of these stories have like features of like the grotesque and body horror. They are strange and scary in places, united by a theme of like characters that have a really deep-rooted, desperate desire for something that can't be sated. You know, they are always hungry. I just think the writing in this book was of such a high quality. Even though I was kind of disgusted or freaked out by some of what I was reading, it was like I absolutely could not look away. And the different voices that the author is able to kind of capture and embody, I thought were just so impressive. Like, I cannot fathom how this author's kind of imagination was working. And this is another one where it elicited such a kind of physical reaction from me when I was reading it. So this is one where I'm not going to say it was particularly like fun reading it, but I think it was kind of like fascinating reading it. And I think in terms of the quality of the writing in this, it's got to be on this list. Another one that is here more so for like in terms of quality than like fun is Intermetzo by Sally Rooney. It's another one where I went into it with quite muted expectations, and I do wonder if that, you know, plays a factor in how I think about books that I enjoyed the most. Like, is the surprise factor pretty significant? You know, if I went into it expecting very little or unsure what to expect, and I actually end up loving it, in some ways, does that make it seem like more impressive than a book that I went into expecting to love it and did love it? But anyway, this is a book that is about the brotherhood between Peter and Ivan, who are dealing with the aftermath and the feelings of grief that they have following their father's death. One of the things that I really appreciated about this book was its exploration of the grief that you feel after the loss of a parent. And I think how like families aren't really good at talking about these things, like specifically Irish families as well. I thought Sally Rooney did a great job of showing the tension in the relationships between these brothers and how they are so like different, and that adds to them like clashing or not seeing each other's perspective. So we have the older brother, who is Peter, who on the surface seems to have this like incredibly successful life. It seems like he's really got it together. But we also see the complications in his romantic relationships and how like he thinks he's like this really sound guy, but actually treats women quite poorly. He finds himself between these two different women who fulfill like different needs from his perspective. And then we have Ivan, who is the younger brother, far more kind of introverted. He is this kind of like chess champion, and he ends up meeting a slightly older woman. I think she's like in her 30s, so like she's not old, but compared to him at like 22, there is like a significant age gap. I thought Sally Rooney did a fantastic job with Ivan's character of painting him in quite a nuanced way, especially as a character who is maybe on the periphery of being sucked into like very dark places of like misogyny and the manosphere. I think relationships between men, but specifically like brotherhood relationships, that kind of sibling relationship, is not something that we see written about a lot. Like, I think there are lots of books out there about sisters, but not as many about brothers. And I think how Sally Rooney explored like masculinity and grief and family was just really impressively done. Like, I think I will always be like a huge Normal People fan. Like, I think that will always be my favorite Sally Rooney book, but I think this is her most accomplished book. And then if I had to pick an absolute favorite for the year, I would say it is Thirst Trap by Grania O'Hare. So again, this is another one that is a proof copy, so I do need to replace it with a finished copy. It's another book that looks at really kind of intense friendships, specifically female friendships in this one. And the three girls at the center of this book are all dealing with the aftermath of their friend dying. So these four girls all lived in a house together. Now there is just three of them. And we follow these girls in their kind of messy early 20s. The different like turbulences and conflicts and messinesses that they all see in their lives. And they're at that stage in their life where their lifestyles are slightly starting to diverge from one another. They're all kind of at that moment where they're like, maybe it's time for us to grow up. And some of them are more ready for that than others. Not only did I really enjoy reading about the messiness of those friendships, and not only was I touched by their experiences of grief and how that experience was not straightforward, it was very complicated. I think the author did an absolutely amazing job of capturing living in a house share in a city in your 20s towards your 30s, and how as you progress towards that, you know, third decade of your life, the things that were once, you know, really appealing and fun start to look a little bit different as you grow up. I don't know, there is just something that is really kind of specific about that like house share in a city stage of your life, and the kind of intensity of the bonds that you create with those people. You know, my experiences of that scenario have been in London, and I have read quite a few books that have a London perspective on these things, but I also really loved seeing this in a different city. So this is set in Belfast, and I do feel like putting those themes in a city that wasn't as familiar to me perfectly blended those feelings of, you know, seeing my own experiences reflected, but also it being a bit different enough to keep it like interesting for me. And I think one of the things that I found particularly impressive about this book was how specific some of the things included were, and how those really specific things were actually the things that made me connect to it and it feel like something that I really recognized. So far for 2026, this is my favorite book of the year. So there we have it. That is my top 10 list of books that I've read so far this year. Thematically, I think there's lots of stuff that is like unsurprising. We've got queer books, we've got Irish books, lots of books about friendships, but also some just like fun romances in there as well. As I said, I'm not sure how many of these books will be on my favorite books of the year, like at the end of the year, because not all of these were like 5 stars. Like a few of them were like very strong 4 stars. And just looking at some of the books that I have on my shelves that I'm going to be reading in the second half of the year, I've got really high expectations for those books. So I'm looking forward to checking in with you guys at the end of the year and seeing where we're at. Let me know down in the comments if you've read any of these books, if you enjoyed them as much as I did, or if you felt differently about them, if you have any recommendations for me based on this list of favorites. And if you want to let me know you're here but you don't have anything in particular to say, leave me either a honey or a spice emoji in honor of honey and spice. That is it for me today. I hope you're well, and I'll speak to you in my next video.